The author's shelf.
The author's shelf.
The author's shelf. The author's shelf. It's about books and stuff.
I have been trying to get this gentleman on Creative Kids Tales for some time, and finally I have secured his time today. I'm sitting with Maurice Gleitzman in Studio 4 Cafe next to Channel 10. Thank you for joining me, Maurice.
It's my pleasure. I'm glad we finally got to have this chat.
Now, Maurice, I understand you've just come from a gruelling session on Studio 10, so I promise I'll be gentle with you.
Not so much grueling as long. It's a fun show to be on, but it goes for 2.5 hours. So I suddenly found myself working much harder than an author is usually working at this time on a Friday morning.
Maurice, can you please tell us what 5 words best describe you?
Hesitant. Mischievous. Emotional. Adventurous. Sensitive. Innumerate.
Thank you very much. All right, tell us about your first story. What prompted you to sit down and write your first story?
Before I ever wrote a story, I spent a few years writing TV comedy sketches and other short form material that strictly speaking didn't constitute stories. And I started to get a sense that I wanted to go one stage further in the process of creating characters and putting words and thoughts and feelings into their mouths for more than just comedic effect. And some of those characters made their presence known in my imagination and declared themselves available for such a project. And so I started writing longer screenplays initially, some television films, some movies, some drama series episodes, many of which didn't get accepted, didn't get made because I was still learning my craft. But it was out of one of those screenplays that my first book grew, because I wrote a television film called The Other Facts of Life, and a publisher who knew that it was being filmed and had read the screenplay asked me to turn the screenplay into a book, which I did really in the spirit of adventure. I thought I'd never get another chance to write a book probably, and so it seemed like an adventure. But by the time I'd finished that adaptation, that sort of reverse adaptation really, compared to how it's usually done, I knew that I'd found the form of writing that was the one for me.
Okay. So tell us about, what was your first book that was published?
It was The Other Facts of Life, and it was the adaptation of my own original screenplay of the same name. It came out, I think, in 1984, and it was where the whole book writing adventure started for me.
Okay, thank you. Would you say that you are a plotter or a pantster? Now, I can clarify that if you...
No, I think...
You know?
I think I know what you mean by that. You mean, am I the sort of person who spends quite a deal of his spare time planning the overthrow of our current elected government, or do I prefer to go out and buy a nice pair of trousers? Well, I'd probably say that I'm a plotter, but in the nice sense of the word. I've always planned out my books. I've learned actually to allow my inner pantster a little bit of freedom. So I plan each book out in detail, but not at great length. Only 3 or 4 pages of notes. I do mini drafts of that plan, and that is a habit that I developed as a screenwriter, because when you're writing for the screen, every second that ends up on the screen has cost a lot of money. So you simply cannot have a scene or even a moment that isn't essential to the story. And that is a very useful habit to develop, because young people, their time is as precious to them as movie investors' money is to them. So they don't want anything in the story that isn't essential to it either. So I plan the story out carefully, so that by the time I'm finally sitting down to write chapter 1, I know exactly where the story is going. I know the physical and the emotional journey of the character, and I know where it ends and why. But that's at the point at which I've learned to let my inner pantser play a part, because what makes the journey more interesting and ultimately results in better stories, I think, is if the author is free to deviate from the roadmap occasionally. And sometimes a little deviation from the map takes one so far away from the map that a new destination appears, and that's the one you decide to head for. But I find it necessary to have the map. I've known, I have very close friends who are writers who do it totally seat of the pants. They'll have a germ of an idea or a glimpse of a character, and they'll sit down and just start pouring words onto the screen, and they'll end up eventually with a first draft that is probably 4 times too long, and it's going to need another 18 drafts to carve it into shape, whereas I never do more than 3, maybe 4 drafts of a book, because even if I've gone deviating away from my plan, that underlying structure is always there, and I always solve those structural problems before I start writing the actual chapters. It's much easier to do. It's I've watched closely people working to try and solve structural challenges when their story is already burdened by all of the actual substance of the chapters, and it's turning the Titanic round sometimes. Not that their book is a Titanic, but then I haven't told you who they are, so it doesn't really matter.
No, that's all right. That's all right. Thank you. Now, do your characters talk to you and tell you their story, or do you create the characters? It's a bit of a strange question. I know when I'm writing, my characters talk to me.
Well, both are happening simultaneously. It's another balancing act that I think each author for each author it's a slightly different balancing act, and you have to find the point of balance that's right for you, because I can't imagine being a passive conduit for these inner voices that simply tell me the whole story, and I'm just a typist. But neither do I want to be a total bossy boots who's lining them up at the beginning of the morning and saying, "Okay, you over there. No, I'm sorry. I don't care if that's what you feel you should be doing. You're over there." That's not going to work either. So it's a balance between the two, and I experience it and understand it as being a balance between 2 parts of me, actually. And I think that's the case, because that's for most fiction writers, most of their characters are parts of them, and so not only are the dramatic conflicts within a story a reflection of conflicts within oneself, but the actual writing process, the fact that it's always a balance between conscious, I can never remember if it's right brain or left brain, but conscious, that bit of the brain control, and sort of and an intuitive ability to just go with what's being presented to you out of your imagination.
Okay, so would you say that you get the idea for the story and then the character comes along, or the character talks to you first and that's how you begin your story? That's where you get the idea?
Either can happen. For me, the absolute heart of the absolute structural heart of a story is the problem or problems that the character is facing in the story. I want them to be the biggest problems in that character's life at the time, and I'll often meet a character in my imagination in the context of their problem. It might just be the context of the emotions they're feeling about that problem. And so I'm then discovering what's going on. I'm checking that this is the biggest problem in their life at the moment, not just something of less significance that into which their sadness or anger is being channeled. Because if we're going to spend our time either writing or reading a story, we want to be connected to the most important aspects of the character's life. Sometimes, though, something happens out in the world and I decide I'd like to explore aspects of it through a story. That was the case, for example, with Boy Overboard, where I saw what was happening in Australia 12 or 13 years ago now with the boatloads of asylum seekers and the way that the whole thing was being politicised and the story that was being told about the people on the boats by certain government ministers and media commentators. And I thought that was a story, well, I just thought that it was an unfair story, so and a largely untrue story. So I decided to try and write a story that would be closer to the truth as I saw it. And having made that decision, I then I had to go to a place in my imagination where I could meet a character and then go through the usual process of finding out that character's problems, some of which would relate, I knew, to being an asylum seeker, having to flee their homeland, etc. But that wasn't enough. I also knew that for it really to be a story, the character needed to have a personal problem that would have been the biggest problem in their life, whether or not external circumstances had caused their family to become asylum seekers. And that, so it was the same as any book. The process was the same as I would do with any book. So it can be either or both those things.
Thank you. That's excellent. Thank you. I've lost my train of thought now. I got lost in your words there, Morris. What's the best piece of writing advice you've ever been given?
Well, I was given it as a screenwriter, and it is the it's one of the two most important pieces of advice that a screenwriter can be given, and it is show, don't tell. Now, screenwriting by definition is a process of showing, because you're primarily telling a story through images. But this is another habit that has stood me in good stead writing for young people, because I think most of us, when we read fiction, even if it's fiction that's quite, that's dealing with quite abstract ideas and themes, we actually want to experience the story as viscerally as possible. And one way we do it is through emotion, of course, but another way we do it is through the images that we are constantly creating for ourselves in our imagination based on the clues and cues that we get from the words. So I write, and always have written, very visually, and I don't write hugely differently for the page than I did for the screen, except that I can be explicit as I like about the thoughts and feelings of characters, rather than giving big hints to actors who are actually going to make that connection with viewers. The other most important piece of advice that any writer can be given, and I actually don't think I was ever given it, I think I just worked it out for myself, is, and I've already expressed it in this conversation, that every story must have at its heart at least one character facing at least one big problem, because that is simply this cultural form that over millennia we called story. This is obviously what we want to be present in every story, because it is present in every story, absolutely every story.
Thank you. Now, your stories entertain children on both the lighter side of life and also deal with serious issues. What is the secret to engaging your audience on serious issues but without becoming too heavy for the readers?
Well, I think it's that stories have this great privilege and opportunity that, say, for example, news media doesn't. The news media's responsibility is to tell us the most important things that are happening in the world on a day-to-day, minute-by-minute basis, and what we seem to want from them is that it be mostly bad news, because that's what it is, and that's, you know, that performs an important function. But stories have the ability to honestly reflect what's going on in the world, including the dark and dismaying stuff, but at the same time to remind us, by taking us inside the hearts and minds of characters, that we are as capable of showing our best potential as a species. We're just as capable of that as we are of showing our worst. And my approach has always been that life is a mixture of both of those things. I think we're all individually capable of both the absolute best and the absolute worst that we're capable of. And so a story is a balance of the two. And it's what makes life rich and fascinating to live, is that things aren't always going to be good. There are always problems. People don't always behave or think in the way that we would like them to, or that they would like to, for a million reasons. Sometimes we go to darker places, and this is a very, very important thing for young people to be able to experience and come to be familiar with through their stories, I think, because it is the nature of human existence. And while there is a place for entertainment that allows us just for a period to set aside the dark side and just to enjoy some fun or some feel-good fantasies, there's a place certainly for that sort of entertainment and for those sorts of stories. I think for real stories that really help us be better, feel better about our existence, and stay open to the possibilities, the good possibilities of our existence. And these are things that young people deserve almost more than, well, once they've got things like food, shelter, emotional, physical safety, and love, they quickly, with the things I've just been describing, are the things that they most need after those things. And so I find that it's not that difficult really, because even when I'm writing about human behaviour at its most appalling, dismaying and distressing, such as those terrible years of the Holocaust, a story is capable of achieving a very delicate balance of reminding us that even in such terrible circumstances, people are still capable of the best that we would all hope for ourselves and each other, even if the physical reality of countless lives, many, many lives, is that ultimately that best didn't physically prevail. You know, a lot of people suffered terribly. A lot of people lost their lives. And so it is a delicate balance, because the danger, and there have been some quite high-profile stories in recent times set against the Holocaust that I feel have gone too far towards a sort of a feel-good experience for the audience. It's a very delicate balance, but I think it is possible. It's one of the magic things about stories. We can close a book and have experienced to an equal degree things that leave us dismayed and despairing about our species, and things that leave us inspired and optimistic, and that's complex and some would say contradictory, but that life is contradictory often.
Thank you for sharing that, Morris. Do you want to eat? I've got a couple more questions.
That's okay.
Do you want to keep going?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, if you could be any character from any book for a day, who would it be and why?
Any character from any book.
Doesn't have to be your own.
Day.
It can be anyone, even from a childhood book.
Well, oh boy. So many choices, really. So many choices.
You could do anything you want.
I'd quite like to be, this week, or this month, I'd quite like to be Atticus Finch for a day, because that poor bugger who's had to live for 50 plus years, appreciating how much the world admires him, but knowing that he hasn't been truly known, and at last that he is a real human being with some flaws and contradictions. The world is finally having to understand this. And I think it must be a great weight off his shoulders, because we all want to be heroes, but we want to be seen for who we really are, rather than an example of how we wish people could be, which is utterly flawless and therefore inhuman.
Thank you very much. A bit like the story that you told at the CYA conference of the happiest girl. I loved that story about the happiest girl.
Yes, the girl. This was just to illustrate that why every story needs a problem on a technical level.
Absolutely.
And I told a story of a girl who has absolutely no problem in the world, and demonstrated how boring her story would be.
And until all of a sudden a bullet went whizzing past her head. That was kind of a direction I didn't expect the story to go in, but yeah, very entertaining. Not for the happiest girl, unfortunately. All right, each book has a different place in our hearts that we write. Now, I don't want to ask you to pick a favourite, but which book of yours did you have the most fun with when you were writing it?
Well, I think I would have to say, for sheer fun, the first of the Canto books, Toad Rage. It was the first time I'd written a non-human character, and I found that really liberating. First time I'd looked at our species through the eyes of another species. And also, I think I just had a lot of fun being a cane toad for a few months. But I do prefer not to use the word favourite with any of my books. But for other reasons, I would say that the Felix books, Once, and the books that came after it have become my special writing journey in my life, so far anyway. I don't think they're necessarily better books than other books I've written, and I certainly didn't have more fun writing them than any other books, but they feel to me, just a bit special in terms of my own relationship with the character, the experiences I've had both at the writing desk and out in the world as a result of writing them, researching them, and as a result of having written them and various conversations and reactions I've had.
Okay, thank you for that. I just have one last question for you, Morris. What's next for you? Is there anything that you have on the horizon that you can share with us, and forget that your publisher's sitting there if you want to reveal any dark secrets or anything?
I'm writing some short stories at the moment. So next year there will be a third collection of short stories. but I'm between novels. I won't start writing the next one until September, and I know pretty much what my next 4 novels will be. I think a couple of them will be Felix books. I think that trilogy will end up having 7 books in it. That's my plan at the moment, anyway. But I don't think the next novel I write won't be one of those Felix books, because I finished one 2 or 3 months ago, and I like to have a bit of a break for a number of reasons. And I prefer not to go into. I'm happy to, talk about future Felix books, because I'm so close to the character that I know they're going to happen. I hesitate to talk about books I haven't yet written involving new characters. I'm sure you understand, because mostly, not because I'm worried they won't happen, mostly because when they're still in flux and I'm still discovering the story and getting a sense of the story, I've discovered to my cost in the past that if I tell people about it, it starts to crystallize in that version of it, and that might not be the version that I want it to crystallize in. So I'll just say that I'll be starting another novel in August.
Okay. Thank you very much, Maurice Gleitzman, for joining me on Creative Kids Tales, and I hope this will be the first of many podcasts coming up, and thank you very much for your time today.
It's my great pleasure.
Thank you. That was wonderful. Thank you very much for that. And